In this session, we'll cover the adjustments and techniques available in Capture One that allow you to get the very best out of your night sky images. Now, shooting the galaxy above our heads can be incredibly fun and especially rewarding when we see the results. It's a great way of exploring how locations look at night, as well as experimenting with different camera settings. This shot, for example, was taken while I was playing with the zoom ring on my lens for a short period within a long exposure of an amazing view of the Milky Way. But photographers often return home to be disappointed with the content they shot once they see it on a big screen. The image can look flat or dull or not as vivid as they remember, often with a sort of muddy tint to it, and they don't know why. Well, in this session, we'll uncover the tools you need to know to get those images back to how you remember. And back to how you remember is a key message here. We all remember a scene very differently to each other. To some, the night sky is a deep, cool blue. To others, the lights from surrounding areas make it feel warmer or even more pink in tone. So the techniques we'll run through here are designed to get your image to look and feel how you want it to in as natural a way as possible. But before we get into the editing side, let's just briefly touch on how we capture the night sky to get the best results when we post-process. There's really not much secrecy around this. We're limited in what we can do at night with most of the cameras that are on the market, but here are the key settings you need to bear in mind. First, ISO. You're going to need a high ISO, but only push it as high as your camera will allow without introducing significant noise. Be really careful at high ISOs if your sensor isn't capable of shooting well in low light. Then aperture, basically as wide as your lens will allow, but f2.8 should really be seen as a minimum. Ideally you want 1.4 or 1.8 if possible. We need to capture as much light as you can physically allow into that sensor. Shutter speed comes next. We need to keep this to a range below 25 seconds or 30 seconds at a push. It's simply to stop the stars in your image from moving across the frame, turning from points of light into lines or trails, unless of course that's the specific look that you're going for. And then finally, focal length. In most cases you'll want this to be as wide as possible to get more of the night sky in your shot, but somewhere around the 35mm equivalent of sort of 12 to 24mm, that should do just fine. Of course you can go longer, but you'll notice more movement in the stars and capture less of the overall galaxy in your shot as a result. In essence, my simple rule is as wide as possible, as fast as possible, and as sensitive as possible without too much noise, or a compromise of that triangle if one element in your setup isn't quite up to scratch. When it comes to actually taking the shot, focus is then the most important factor. You're going to need to focus on infinity in 90% of cases, and that focus is going to be manual. There are a variety of techniques to doing this in the dark, but a lot of it comes with trial, error, zooming in and out, adjusting and trying again. Your depth of field shouldn't be too much of an issue on a wide lens, but do make sure you keep checking the foreground in the preview screen just in case you're in one of those 10% of other cases that needs a closer focusing point. And then finally, exposure. Your camera is going to tell you that the scene is underexposed. Of course it is. Anything less than middle grey will be classed by the meter in your camera as underexposed, and we're out here shooting in the dark. So don't rely on your meter. Instead, use the preview screen and histogram after every shot and adjust accordingly. If you're light painting the foreground, bear that in mind so you don't overexpose those elements as you're shooting too. In an ideal scenario, when you look at the histogram in the back of your camera, you want to see that left-hand side here of the histogram drops down just before the zero wall at the lower end of the shadows. So let's take a look at the stars themselves without any distractions of any foreground and see what we need to consider when we're editing. So looking at our histogram here, we can see that most of this scene is indeed dark, just as the night sky. But what about the stars themselves? So people always seem to think they'll be bright and overexposed in comparison to the sky, right? Well, actually no. Let's just zoom right in. So aside from all the noise in this shot, and there's quite a lot, we can see the stars range from this one here in the middle, which is pretty bright. It's up there at the sort of 200 mark if you check the value on the top of the bar up here. Right the way down to fully in the shadows if I pick on some of these stars here. So 54 out of 255, 85, 49, 39, and so on. And of course everything in between. We can also use this orange line on the histogram. As you see, I'm walking across the screen. As I do that, that orange line moves around the histogram. And that's showing me live feedback for exactly where on the scale the pixels under my mouse pointer sit. That's going to be really handy in a second. So why is the fact that the stars actually sit in the shadows important? Well, let's think about one of the tools we'd often consider using to enhance the stars. It'd be contrast, right? Well, Wrong, actually, because the contrast tool is designed to force the histogram out from the center. So it goes from the center out towards the edges, making the bright elements brighter and the dark elements even darker still. If we use that tool, while we've made the highly exposed stars a little bit brighter, we've actually made most of the other stars even darker. Why? Well, because they sat in the shadows. So we're forcing those shadows to move to the left of the histogram, taking the stars with them and underexposed. And the few highlights we had remaining will move to the right, but you don't really notice them because half of our galaxy is now missing. This is also why the HDR tool's whites and highlights sliders only work on a limited number of stars in any shot. So, how do we enhance and increase the clarity of the Milky Way in a night sky shot? Well, the clue's in the question really, it's with the clarity tool. So for those of you who've watched our pro tips session on the clarity tool itself, you'll remember the way that it works, but essentially it identifies the borders where there are differences between two areas, one relatively lighter or darker than their neighbour. It makes them then even lighter or even darker in comparison to each other, which is perfect for what we're trying to do here. The star may not be bright, but it's definitely brighter than the dark sky that it's surrounded by. So adding a little bit of neutral or natural clarity will give our stars even more definition and the scene a lot more pop overall. Now be really careful with its partner of structure. We also covered this in the pro tips session on clarity, but it's looking for texture and it's going to pick up any noise in the shadows and make features of noise instead of allowing it to all disappear into the background. While we're speaking of noise, let's just take a quick look over on the Details tab. Now, as you'd expect, Capture One will have applied the correct amount of noise reduction and sharpening for your particular lens and camera combination. But the temptation is often to use even more noise reduction on the night sky to try and clean it up. Well, here's a surprising message from me for the first time. Don't use noise reduction if you don't have to. We could, let's just zoom right in so we can show you what we're talking about here. So we could dial in some luminance noise reduction. But then if I do that, we lose sharpness, and actually we lose some of the stars in that process. So we could dial in some detailed noise reduction. But when dealing with the night sky, we end up rather ironically introducing what seems to be even more noise as a result. So that's no good to us. Color noise reduction can help us. The result is normally sharper than using luminance on its own. It doesn't really add much more noise itself. But you might find some strange patterns and artifacts when you print the whole image as a result of using it too much. So as with all of these things, just be careful with how much you're using them. The one that I tend to stay away from specifically, however, especially with stars, is the single pixel removal function. Why? Well, it's designed to remove tiny little bright spots of light which are out of place in the surrounding area, kind of like, well, a star, right? So while the single pixel removal tool can help with a hot or stuck pixel, it does very, very slightly reduce the number of visible stars that you captured. So I would leave it and manually fix the 1 or 2 hot pixels instead, if you can even find them in the shot. So accepting we're limited in terms of how much noise reduction we can actually do, how do we make the stars really pop without adding noise if the contrast tool is also off limits? Well, levels is the answer. And specifically levels and curves for those of you that want to perform some slightly more advanced histogram adjustments. But it's the levels tool that really is the killer feature here. Remember, levels allows us to stretch out the histogram. We can decide what we consider to be shadows and what we consider to be highlights by shifting those input levels along the bottom to where the data in our histogram actually sits. So that means we're telling Capture One to treat certain elements in the photo, such as those darker stars, as if they were more brightly exposed, while leaving the shadows where they were. Or we can even make the shadows darker if we choose as well. Be really careful adjusting this mid-tone slider in levels, you can have some unwanted effects. But bear in mind that we can also apply levels to a specific part of the image, not just the whole thing, by using a gradient mask or a painted mask with the brush. And it means that you don't have to affect the entire foreground or the whole image in the same way. Then finally, we come on to white balance. And this is possibly the most contentious area when it comes to editing the sky at night. Your camera's auto white balance is likely to get this wrong at the point of capture, especially if you've got foreground lights involved where they're artificial lighting. So unless you've set it manually to some extent or another, you'll need an element of color temperature and tint correction when you load the image into Capture One. Going back to what I said earlier about getting the scene back to how you remember it, that's what's important at this stage. To me, the night sky has always felt cool, with a cold temperature of light, so I tend to have my white balance set to somewhere between sort of 3 and 4,000, and a tint of somewhere between sort of 1 and 10, but it really is a case of experimenting, and it depends on the image itself. There are, of course, out there what's called light pollution filters. There's many brands that make them, and they can help with cooling the scene at the point of capture and cutting certain wavelengths of light to stop effectively light pollution. We've actually reviewed them in depth on our website, but in reality, I wouldn't recommend a single one of them for use on these types of shots. And there's a simple reason why. When you're using one of these filters, you still need to set a manual white balance, and they actually cut an amount of light, sometimes actually up to a whole stop in the process of being used. So, all of that light that you've just spent a fortune on the right equipment to capture in the first place, you're now cutting it to save yourself a little bit of time in the editing room. So with that white balance change, we now have a corrected view of the stars alone. We could actually go into our curves tool and just bring that up a touch there. With all of that done, let's apply some of those techniques to some more interesting shots, let's say, with some foreground elements. So, welcome to New Zealand, Lake Tekapo to be precise. Sadly, it's now yet another honeypot for tour buses full of Instagrammers and so on, but it's still an amazing place to experience and see the Milky Way. This church has become impossibly famous, mostly because of its lakeside sort of setting and how perfectly photogenic it always seems to be. Now, in this shot, we've got the corner of the Milky Way up above, but also the church and the ground below with the mountains in the distance and maybe a little touch of a warm glow from some light in the town. Now, let's get started first with the overall white balance of the scene. Of course, I could actually split this using two different masks, but to me, making it a little cooler all around, probably to somewhere like 3500-ish, and then a little bit of tint, that gives me the right feel to this shot overall. So I'm going to stick with one overall white balance for now. Now let's turn on that clarity tool. We can push it relatively high here, but not so much that we're introducing excessive noise. If I want to suppress the noise a little more, well, we could just sort of gently adjust some of those sliders on the details tab, but just go careful with them because you're going to risk making some of the image worse if you get it wrong. So by moving the cursor around the image, just like we did before, we can use our little orange line on that histogram to confirm that most of the sky indeed sits in the shadows area. So we can actually use our HDR tool right now to bring that section down and instantly add some contrast. We can also slide those highlights and whites all the way up. They're not going to have a massive effect, as we've already discussed, but those stars that are in those highlight areas are now going to get a little boost too. Now, what about levels? Well, I want to increase the levels of contrast in the upper sky, but I really don't want to pull too much of this foreground up at the same time. So unlike the last scene where we did the whole thing across the whole image, in this one, we're going to use a gradient mask because that's going to help us control what's actually pulled up. So let's create a new layer with a new gradient mask, really, really soft from top to bottom. And with that mask, let's adjust our levels from there. So this then only applies to that adjustment layer. I'm going to pull our highlights in, but I'm also going to pull our shadows down as well. Now, if I don't like the vignette that's now occurred on the image, well, I've got two ways of dealing with that. One, of course, is in the lens profile, so I could put our light fall off up a little bit. And then the second, of course, we've got our vignette tool itself, and we could obviously dial that in a touch too. I'm relatively happy with that result. So now let's look at the warmth out on the horizon. So if that were bothering me, I'll create a new layer and we'll call it warm. And I'm going to actually draw a very quick mask over this section here with our brush. And with a low opacity set, I can just go over it a few times here. And now I can go to my color editor. And my color editor, I'm not going to use the basic tab. I'm going to go to advanced. I'm going to choose this area here of potentially light pollution. Tell the color editor I want to select all of the color around this area here. And with that color, I'm going to pull the lightness down and maybe the saturation down and maybe the hue altered a little bit too. Now, to me personally, I kind of like the glow. So to me, it's probably going to stay. But the color editor is your friend when you're trying to get rid of those warm glows of the city out there as well. And equally, you can use a gradient mask to control the area that color editor is affecting too. So that's our first edit. So let's look at before and after. we go from a relatively flat scene with some of the sort of murky effect up in the sky to a set of stars in the Milky Way that really pop over a really cool church down below. So what about where we have a foreground that's not particularly well illuminated? So let's say there was no moonlight at all, or the object was too far away to even add some light, just like here. So this is a shot of the Milky Way over the top of Mount Cook. So here we have a challenge. We need to bring up the brightness of the mountain range down here while keeping the feel of the sky and the stars above. As an added bonus, we've actually got a little shooting star over here above the peaks. So just as before, we're going to start with the white balance. Let's get it to within that sort of 3000 to 4000 range. So I'm just going to go back to my exposure tab to do that. And we're probably going to go to a bit cooler, maybe there. And I'm going to pull my tint up to match that feel there. Now, of course, what we could do is take a reading from the snow on these mountain tops, but just be careful because sometimes the snow reflects some of the light, especially in moonlight, and you can get a false reading. But you can already see how much of a difference we've already dialed in compared to that auto setting that we had before. So we'll now start the work of separating the two areas, the sky and the foreground. What we'll do is we'll create two gradient filters that will affect the two parts in different ways. So first, let's draw the one for the foreground. So brand new layer, we're going to call this one foreground. And we're going to stretch up a gradient mask with quite a soft transition because I don't want a harsh line over the mountain. And using our mouse again, so as I move the mouse around the image, we see the orange line in the histogram. Down here, it's very, very firmly in the blacks area of the histogram. It's not in shadows. Shadows are around here. It's fully in the lowest parts of the histogram range. So it's the black slider that we're going to use to pull that up. And there comes our foreground. Pretty cool. Now I'm going to edit the gradient itself using the Alt key or the Option key just to make it slightly asymmetrical so the fall off is a bit harder over these mountains. Now, of course, if we have more time, we don't in this session, but we could, of course, refine that mask a little bit further. We could edit some of the edges. We could even erase parts that aren't relevant to us. But for the purposes of this, that's given us enough to separate out the foreground and be able to see some of the detail again. So now for the sky. Same principle. We're going to create a brand new layer. I'm going to call it sky. And let's draw another gradient. And that gradient is going to be pulled down here. So not quite over the mountains. And then with that gradient, we're going to pull up our clarity, just like before. And we're going to use our levels to bring those stars a little bit more vivid in this scene. Now, of course, overall, I could go back to the background and I could use that little hump in our curve just to really make the image pop. But while there's some final tweaking to do to fix maybe some of the mask areas here, these are the essences of what you need to consider when you've got a foreground and a sky that aren't evenly illuminated. So we now have a foreground that's visible again. Quite a difference in the before and after result if I go from before to after. And it's literally taken a few clicks. Obviously, the more time we spend on this stuff, the better it's going to be. But in essence, that's our edit. Now, just looking at this shot in particular, we could probably afford to put in a little bit of extra sharpening. So back on our background layer, in fact, no, we're going to do it on our sky layer. I'm just going to dial in a touch more sharpening just to make those stars really crisp. Now, you want to be careful that you don't introduce too much noise, but in overall terms, that looks pretty neat to me. So what if we have enough light, or indeed we've actually added some to the shot? So we can use the same technique here to edit the image, but we can also then apply a different white balance to the top and to the bottom based on the fact that we've used artificial light in our scene. So in this case here, we're out in the Badwater salt flats of Death Valley. We can use two really simple gradients to control the look of the floor, which was briefly lit, in contrast to the galaxy above our heads. So let's draw our first gradient. I'm just going to switch back to my exposure tab to do that. So I've got a gradient here and we'll call it hexagons. And it's going to be quite a hard gradient along that valley floor. And with that gradient, I'm just going to adjust our white balance to be cooler and our tint to get the salt flats relatively neutral here. I could actually dial in a little bit of clarity, and actually on here we could afford some structure because there's actually quite a lot of texture in those salt formations. And then for the sky, so let's create a new layer, sky, And with this one, again, same thing. We can have really harsh gradient down here because we've got these rather handy mountains down at the bottom to help with that. And with our sky, well, we're going to have a slightly different white balance, certainly a bit stronger tint here. We're going to have our standard sort of clarity dial in, and we're going to do a little bit of a levels adjustment to make the Milky Way really come to life. Be careful with those shadows, but that feels about right. Now, remember, the feel of the image is in huge part down to your white balance setting, and that's the key element that you need to get back to what you remember. I'm dialing in settings based on my taste, but it doesn't mean that they're correct, so try and experiment with this yourself. Now, with these low-toned images, just like we did on the image before, if you need sometimes a bit of an extra boost above what the levels can do, then this is where curves come in. So putting a slight bow in that curve, especially in these sky areas, that can really, really help bring up the midtones more subtly than if I try and do it with the midtone slider in the level section here instead. In this case, that works out pretty good. Now, it'd be wrong if I finish this session without covering a shot with the aurora. So whether it's the northern lights or the southern lights, the show above us when these things become active can be really incredible. And our cameras can actually capture them exceptionally well, quite often better than our eyes. So typically you can get away with a faster shutter speed because the activity in the sky is actually adding quite a bit of light down into the scene. But the principles are the same when you're shooting, and when editing it's not that different either. So clarity is still your friend here. We can dial in a certain amount of clarity just to make that definition in the sky really stand out. It does the same for the strands of the coloured light above our heads as it does for the stars themselves. Levels can also help, but when it comes to aurora, be really careful because it takes a very small level adjustment to accidentally here, look at those numbers on the top, 255, 255, 255. They're now overexposed and they're clipping. So instead of levels, especially with the northern lights or the southern lights, consider using an S-curve in your curves tool instead. A really simple S shape on the histogram, and look at where the data is in that histogram as to where you want to try and make that adjustment. So I'm going to pull down my dark areas here, leave that one where it is, and I'm going to pull up these midtones here. And that gives me a little more contrast. Let me just do without and with, without blowing out any of these highlights. Now, of course, we've got white balance to play with. Now, that's going to be down to what you remember seeing, especially with the variety of colours that are in the sky. But if you can use something neutral like the snow here, then that can help get it right. But just remember, the lights in the sky, especially under aurora, can change the colour of the snow too. So if I pick this wrong, you're going to get a really warm or really strange effect. General terms, just go back to that limit of somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 feels about right, and the tint to match. In this case, I also know that the lens that was being used has got a lot of sharpness fall off. So we're going to go back to our lens correction tab here and dial in quite a bit of sharpness correction on the edges. And to finish, actually, I'm going to go one further. We're going to put in one final little layer, which is going to be called sky. And we're going to create a subtle gradient that leads up to the top of the image with some light fall off. So we're going to add in some extra clarity. And we're going to do an adjustment in our levels, just this bottom shadow bit, just to enhance that look. And then we're done. So again, we go before and after, and that's quite a big difference. So some simple techniques to make your night sky images really come to life. Just remember, there really isn't one blanket recipe for this type of photography, and a lot of the fun is actually in the experimentation itself. So use this as a guide, as a baseline, and build on these techniques with a unique look and feel for your own style of images.